question in the forum. I'm very excited to see the line of hypertrophy programs you mentioned in the last question of Strength Stream. Do you expect to release them anytime soon? The first program is done. Okay, and again, these programs are kind of long to write because it's literally like one page for every workout. So like a 6 weeks workout is going to be like 70 pages. Because it also acts as a training journal. So you write down the weight, you have your daily workouts, and you can actually write down what you're doing. So it takes me a long time to write. The first one is done. I started doing the second one. I'm starting with 3 programs, maybe 4. I might have a hybrid program. So I expect to have 1 program done per week. So I would say that within 2 or 3 weeks, all programs will be done. It's just a matter of having the great crew at T-Nation edit them to make them look badass, because I'm old school. I work with Word. All right. Next question. What is the best type of resistance training for improving insulin sensitivity? Low volume and max effort, or higher volume with some reps in reserve? Okay. Sorry. I'm going to get back to that. I was waiting on YouTube for the stream, and now my cortisol is up. How do I fix it? I would say 5 grams of glycine and let's say 1,000 milligrams of magnesium taurate, ideally. Glycine will actually calm down the nervous system, which will reduce adrenaline and cortisol, and magnesium dislodges the adrenaline from the receptor, which also calms you down. I'll never forget that the best anti-cortisol supplement is carbohydrates. All right, let's get back to a regularly scheduled question, which type of training is better to improve insulin sensitivity? That's a good question. And first, we need to talk a bit about insulin sensitivity. Okay, it's kind of popular nowadays, and it goes back to my initial monologue, right? When you get married to a concept or an idea and you make it that part of your own belief. And when it comes to nutrition, the very popular one is to say that the only thing that matters when it comes to losing fat is being in a caloric deficit. I mean, and strictly from a mechanical perspective, I guess it's right. But in reality, the fact is that within your body, you have so many different factors that can actually influence metabolic rate, that will actually influence caloric output on a daily basis. And one of them is insulin sensitivity. Now, you have people who claim that insulin will make you fat. Yeah, not so much. The issue is more that insulin, and again, insulin does play a role in how easy or hard it is to lose fat. Okay, absolutely. But it doesn't go against the only calories matter. Okay, I'm going to explain. Insulin, when it's high, it slows down metabolic rate. If you want to learn more about this, you can look at the work of Professor Ben Bickman, who's a metabolic scientist at Brigham Young University, and has conducted studies on that. He actually mentioned some of those studies and other studies on his Instagram and other materials, conferences that he has online. Basically, when insulin is chronically elevated, it slows down metabolic rate, which can actually, even though people won't like to hear this, can actually give low-carb dieting a slight metabolic advantage. I'm saying it's probably like 200 to 300 calories per day. So by keeping insulin low, your metabolic rate is probably going to be 200 to 300 calories higher. You are spending 300 calories more just by being on a low-carb diet and keeping insulin low. But you don't actually need to be low carbs to do that. You can have carbs that have a low glycemic index, and you could also improve insulin sensitivity, because what insulin sensitivity means is that the more sensitive you are, the easier you respond to insulin. So it means that when you're eating something and insulin is released to clear the bloodstream of the nutrients you ingested, you don't need a lot of insulin to get the job done, because the small amount of insulin does the work. The cells will open up, and then you will store the glycogen, you store the fat, you store the amino acids, right? If you are resistant to insulin, it means that your cell don't respond well to insulin. So for the same amount of food, you need to release a lot more insulin to get the message across. Make sense? That doesn't mean that you store more fat, because in fact, if you're resistant, it means that it's harder for you to store nutrients. But you're producing more insulin because you need a stronger signal to tell your body to store, okay? So far, so good. Excellent. So how does it impact metabolic rate? Well, again, when insulin is kept high, metabolic rate slows down. So if you are insulin sensitive, you're producing a small amount of insulin because you're responsive, so it comes back down very quickly after your meal. So you spend a very little time under high insulin state. Now, if you are resistant to insulin, you need to produce a lot more insulin for the same meal, so it stays high for a lot longer. So for a lot longer, your body is in a decreased metabolic rate state. So if you're constantly like that, then the metabolic rate might be 300 calories per day slower. Make it harder to be in a caloric deficit. See what I mean? It's still about caloric deficit, but hormones and other substances will play a role in how much energy you are using every day, which means that it is impacting the calories in versus calories out balance. Now, let's get back to training and insulin sensitivity. Honestly, it doesn't matter that much. As much as it pains me to say so, higher volume probably is a bit better in that regard. Well, with a caveat here, sensitive higher volume. I'm gonna put an asterisk here, and I'm gonna explain it afterwards. But basically, the more volume with lifting, the more glycogen you use in your muscles. So the more glycogen you use, the more space you create in the muscle, the easier it is to store nutrients in the muscle, so the less insulin you need. Basically, the more you empty out muscle glycogen, the more sensitive to insulin the muscle becomes. The analogy I can give you is, let's say you're taking a flight, right? And you have the overhead bin and your carry-on luggage, and you want to fit the carry-on luggage in the overhead bin. Now, if you are in like a small national national plane flight, so you're flying local, it's likely going to be a very small overhead bin, and it's normally jam-packed with people. So it's very hard for you to push it out. So you're twisting and turning, pushing hard, pulling, lots of effort to get the bag into the overhead bin. Now, if you are on an international flight and you're flying first class, the overhead bins are gigantic. There's very less people in there, so it's very easy to put it out. So it's very low effort. The effort to put the bag in is the insulin. So when there's a lot of room, you don't need lots of effort to store the luggage, right? So if there's a lot of room in your muscle for glycogen, you don't need lots of insulin to be able to send the glucose and the blood inside those muscles. Okay. Now, if the muscle is full, then it's harder. So the more volume you do, the more you empty out the muscle, the more likely it is to be empty after workout or has more room. So it's going to influence insulin sensitivity the most. Okay. Also, it will upregulate GLUT4, which increases transport to muscle, and so on and so forth. The caveat is muscle damage actually has the opposite effect. So if you create too much muscle damage, it makes your muscle more resistant to insulin, at least until that damage is fixed. And volume tends to create more muscle damage. So it needs to be sensitive volume. Like doing 30 sets is probably too much. But in the higher hand, like let's say 10 sets per body part in a workout, that's probably better than the high effort 1 or 2, like 3 sets for muscle to failure. But in the grand scheme of things, that's in the short term. Like you will burn muscle glycogen for the recovery period, like a few hours after your workout, you're more sensitive. But if you look at the big picture, the only thing that really matters is making the muscle bigger. The bigger muscle is, the more insulin sensitive your muscles will be. First, because a bigger muscle has more room to store glucose. So it's like getting a bigger overhead bin. And also because the greater the surface of the muscle is, the more insulin receptors you have on the muscle. So the more insulin receptors mean you more easily respond to insulin, so you're more insulin sensitive. So honestly, in the short term, like if I want to have carbs right now, what kind of training should I do to minimize the risk of storing those carbs as fat? I would say higher volume. But in the grand scheme of things, the important thing is just building muscle. If you build muscle, you will improve insulin sensitivity. All right. Next question. Okay, last question for today. I train to failure with a very high volume of work, and I'm starting to feel tired and unmotivated. Is this a sign of central nervous fatigue? How should I adjust my training? Okay, first, I like the analogy that you can either train hard or you train a lot. It's not recommended to do both. So having a high volume of work and pushing all the work sets to failure is a recipe for disaster. In fact, even if you're on steroids, it will backfire because it won't help with what's called neurological fatigue. Now, it's probably not central fatigue, especially if you feel like crap. If you feel like almost depressed, if you feel like your motivation is going away, if you feel lazy, if you feel that you have no drive, you feel almost, I don't want to say depressed, but like almost burned out, it's likely not central fatigue. Central fatigue is not something that you feel. It's just a weakening of the excitatory drive from the central nervous system to the muscles. It's not something you feel. In fact, you can actually, and you've seen that many times, I'm sure, that you might actually feel awesome, amazing, and then I'm gonna like really crush some weights today, and then all of a sudden, you know what, you're like 10% weaker than you thought you would be. And other times you feel, I feel like complete crap. There's no way I can train hard today, and so you actually hit a PR on that day. Okay, the way you feel is not necessarily a sign of central fatigue. It's just a weakening of this. You don't feel it. Okay, what you can feel, what can make you lazy, what can make you unmotivated, borderline burned out, is a downregulation of the beta adrenergic receptors. These are the receptors that interact with your own adrenaline to amp you up. At the muscle site level, if you bind adrenaline to the beta receptors, it makes the muscle fire harder, contract harder, produce more speed, more power, more strength. It also makes the muscle feel harder to touch, higher muscle tone. If the adrenaline binds to the beta receptors in your cardiac or heart tissue, it increases heart rate, also increases the contraction strength of your heart, which makes it easier to send blood and oxygen to the muscles. Endurance goes up. Okay, if it binds to the beta receptors in your brain, it increases motivation, competitiveness, drive, sensation of strength, invincibility, and stuff like that. Okay, now if those receptors become resistant to adrenaline, then you don't get all of that. So the muscles are weaker, they're not contracting as hard, they feel softer to the touch. Cardiovascularly speaking, you will be out of breath faster. It's harder to clear out the metabolites from the muscles. Ironically, when you suffer from beta adrenergic downregulation, your performance in the gym will suck, but for some reason you get a better pump. Like the lactic acid just builds up. The reason is that you cannot send enough blood to the muscle to clear out the lactate after your set. Okay, so the pump can actually, I'm still training hard and getting a pump. Yeah, but if your performance goes down, it might be bad. At the brain level, it decreases your motivation. It makes you unfocused, undriven, more negative, almost burned out like sensation. Okay, and that happens when you produce too much adrenaline. Now, adrenaline is produced in response to an increase in cortisol. So the more cortisol you produce, the more adrenaline you produce. That's why, for example, when you're stressed out and you go to bed at night, it's very hard to fall asleep because cortisol, stress, okay, is high, which converts noradrenaline to adrenaline. So adrenaline is high when cortisol is high. Adrenaline makes your brain goes on and on and on and on and on. So you cannot go to sleep. You're twisting and turning and you're thinking, you're creating those scenarios in your head and you just can't fall asleep. Okay, but it's the same thing with training. So if you're constantly producing dumping cortisol, you are probably increasing adrenaline too much, and it stays with you for a long time. The longer it stays connected to the beta receptors, the more likely you are to make them resistant. Now, the beta adrenergic receptors and the insulin receptors are the two receptors in the human body that desensitizes the fastest. That's because in both cases, overstimulation of those receptors can actually lead to dying. I mean, if you overstimulate the beta receptors, you can have a heart attack. That actually happened with young kids in great shape playing sport and using too many energy drinks or like stimulants, going to a rave party doing stimulants, and they just have a heart attack because they just overstimulate their beta receptors. And the insulin receptors, you can go into if you're too sensitive or if you stimulate those receptors too much, you can go in hypoglycemic coma. Okay, so because of that, those receptors become resistant very, very easily if they are overstimulated. When it comes to training, volume is the main thing that would increase cortisol, thus adrenaline. But also, the three main factors that increases cortisol in training are volume, level of effort, so the proximity to failure, and psychological stress. So for example, if I'm attempting a maximum load, I never tried that before, I'm getting some anxiety before the set, I'm amping myself up, it will jack up cortisol and adrenaline. If I'm doing a WOD in a CrossFit box just the anticipation of how much it's going to suck will increase cortisol and adrenaline. So that's why when I was doing WODs with my wife, just driving to the box, I was like shaking, I was sweating, my heart rate was high because of the anticipation of the suck to come, right? So these three factors are the main causes of increasing cortisol adrenaline. So if two of them are very high, then the likelihood of overproducing cortisol and adrenaline are very high also. So you need to have one of these two to be emphasis. So if you go to failure, but volume needs to be lower. If you want to do higher volume, you need to keep some reps in reserve. Okay. So what you can do to that is just adjust your training. So depending on the phase you're in, you emphasize one factor. In the next phase, you can emphasize the other. That would be my first recommendation. Second, you want to decrease cortisol as much as possible after training, not during training, because it helps you train hard. So that means that your first friend is carbohydrates. The best supplement to lower cortisol is carbohydrates. Carbohydrates can be sedative, meaning they decrease cortisol and adrenaline. That's why when you are stressed out, subconsciously, you will want to eat sugar or carbs at night because the brain knows it's going to bring itself down. Okay, so carbohydrate, I like to use Surge Workout Fuel. Also, obviously, I mentioned that in a semi-joke earlier, but magnesium and glycine post-workout will bring yourself back down. The magnesium actually dislodge the adrenaline from the beta receptors. So by dislodging the adrenaline from the receptors, you avoid making those receptors resistant, okay, because they're not being overstimulated. And glycine is a neurological inhibitor. It calms you down, also increases serotonin, which also calms you down. So these would be my recommendations. All right, question here. Do you take fiber supplements? No, I do not. I don't have an answer for that. I mean, especially when I'm building muscle, I'm actually eating a decent amount of grains. I know that's a big no-no in bodybuilding world, but you know what? When I'm building muscle, that's fine. And when I'm leaning out, I normally don't have any issues with motility and going to the bathroom. So it's never something that I've been attracted to personally. All right. So guys, thank you for being here. I will be back next week, same time, so Thursday at 11-ish. Tell your friends, tell your dogs, tell your parents. If you have any questions, you can send them to my Instagram account, which is Christian Thibaudeau Thibarmy, or just do a search for Thibarmy, you're going to find it. Or you can go on my T Nation forum. So you go in the community tab. There's the Christian Thibaudeau coaching forum. You can ask questions there. You can also send me a personal email at chris@ballisticmanagement.com. Or you can go on the YouTube repost of this video and post the questions below, and I will add them to my list. The more good questions I have, the less boring I am. So essentially, the quality of this podcast is entirely dependent on you. If you don't send me good questions, it's going to be boring. So hopefully